Well, for those of you who are no stranger to the Milky Donut, I'm sure you know just how much Milky loves a good atmosphere in a video game or even a movie, to the point that it's actually become kind of a meme here on the channel. There are so many games that I've played within my lifetime, especially during my early childhood, that I barely remember all that much of anymore. I couldn't tell you the names of half the characters, I couldn't draw or explain to you a map of their worlds or even the main locations, and if you asked me to explain exactly what happened throughout their stories, there's absolutely sections I'd have to hop on good old Reddit or YouTube to refresh my memory. But you know what I could tell you, my dear guardian? I could tell you exactly what those games felt like. And this feeling has been amplified times 1000 since beginning my journey through playing old games for my Regress series, where I basically have you guys comment suggestions of older games, and I experience them for the first time. I want to start this video off by talking about some serious fucking atmosphere, okay? When your boy first arrived on the surface of planet Zebes, and yes, I know it's Zebes, but I first pronounced it Zebes, so it's Zebes from now on, okay? Deal with it! But when your boy first arrived on the surface of planet Zebes while standing completely alone as rain poured down around me in Super Metroid, gave me a stronger sense of atmosphere than just about any quote-unquote modern game has for at least the past 10 years. Just being completely surrounded by rain while really nothing overly extravagant is happening on screen, except for the sound of the storm and this eerie, dark, and enormous abandoned world waiting just beneath my feet. When I stepped into Dracula's castle in Symphony of the Night for the very first time, and got the feeling that every single hallway, staircase, and creepy library were all contributing to something a lot larger in scope than just simply giving me another obstacle to overcome. I'll always remember the oppressive yet metal emptiness of Demon's Crest, and the warmth and color of Secret of Mana and its cozy towns. All of these tiny little worlds in reality should feel almost primitive compared to what we're capable of creating now, but somehow they don't. At all. They all manage to completely absorb me in their very own ways, and most of the time, a lot more than any modern game has done for me in recent years. After spending so much time experiencing these older games for the first time, I've realized that some of my strongest memories aren't of bosses, mechanics, cutscenes, or even the stories. They're the memories of places and the feelings that those places gave me. And that might sound a bit strange because, well, obviously none of these places are real. They're just a collection of pixels on a screen and sound effects running on hardware that in some cases is older than I am. And on top of all of that, compared to what developers are capable of creating today, a lot of these worlds are unbelievably small. Super Metroid's entire map of Zebes would probably fit inside the tiniest corner of some modern AAA open world maps. And Dracula's castle is ultimately just a collection of interconnected rooms that I've convinced myself is an actual place. But when I think back on my recent experiences with these games, those places all felt like huge, vast worlds. And not because of how much there was to do inside of them, but because of how effective they are at convincing me to believe that I was somewhere real, with history and deep lore, even if there wasn't any. So why do these old games feel so much more immersive than 90% of the games that we get today? Well, for starters, I think we've gotten so consumed by fixating on graphics, realistic gameplay that feels slow as shit, overly cinematic stories, frame rates, and massive open worlds, that a lot of games have forgotten to talk about that one feeling. And I think you know the feeling that I'm talking about. The feeling of experiencing exceptional atmosphere. Something that I've been consistently learning through my Regress series is that atmosphere isn't really one mechanic at all. It's the combination of music, or in some cases the lack thereof, lighting, color, environmental sounds, architecture, pacing, mystery, environmental storytelling, and sometimes the deliberate absence of any one of those things. It's the difference between simply looking at a world and feeling like you're actually living inside of it. And the more older games I play, the more I've started wondering whether that feeling is part of the reason why they feel so different. And I'm not saying they're necessarily better in every single way, and definitely not because every game that was made 30 years ago knew some secret, ancient, forbidden art of game design that's been long since lost. But because a lot of the design philosophies surrounding these older games naturally created an atmosphere that modern games sometimes seem almost designed to avoid. Somewhere during our obsession with making games bigger, faster, more convenient, and less niche, I think a lot of games have become almost afraid of leaving the player alone. I don't think I played anything that led me to this realization more than Super Metroid for the SNES. When I first started playing through the Metroid series, I understood extremely quickly why exploration was such a huge part of its legendary identity. But Super Metroid was the game where I finally understood why people, including you guys in my comments, have talked about the atmosphere with nearly the same reverence as the gameplay, bosses, or any other aspect of the game for that matter. Samus slowly descends onto the surface of Zebes, steps out into a dark, rainy environment, and there isn't a single overly indulgent cinematic that jumps in just to try to tell me how dangerous this planet is. You can just feel it. Nobody is standing there to explain what happened. There aren't any other characters that are constantly yapping at you, telling you to go this way or go that way. And the game isn't scared of the fact that I, God forbid, might spend a minute without being quote-unquote entertained. You're just here. And eventually you return to locations that are connected to the original Metroid, which I didn't know at the time as I hadn't played OG Metroid yet, except they're deserted now. And even though I wasn't familiar with Nestroid, there's still something truly eerie about walking through spaces that make you feel like something should be there. And once I did play Nestroid and Zero Mission, I truly realized just how well Super Metroid understood that recognizing a place and noticing what's changed can be way more effective than having someone explain that change for you. And that extreme sense of isolation follows you throughout nearly the entirety of your journey, because Zebes feels like a hostile ecosystem that's been here long before I ever arrived, and would continue to exist long after I left. Brinstar's atmosphere feels different from Norfair's atmosphere, which feels different from Meridia's atmosphere, and those differences are communicated through color, architecture, enemies, and especially sound. Sometimes the music is quiet and melodic, and sometimes what you're hearing doesn't even feel like music at all, just strange mechanical droning sounds and distant noises that make you feel completely alone, but you feel like something's lurking in the darkness. It made me realize that silence does not contribute to an absence of atmosphere, and as a matter of fact, I found that a lot of the time silence is actually what allows atmosphere to thrive. It's the same reason why an empty hallway or a liminal space in a movie is usually more unsettling than actually showing you whatever monster is supposedly lurking within them. Your brain actually starts doing the work for the film because you're just staring into the darkness waiting for something to move, letting your imagination run completely wild. But video games are able to take that idea one step further because you're the idiot goofball who actually has to walk down that hallway or endless liminal space. A game can put me at the entrance of a creepy area and make the pacing of that scenario partially mine. Maybe I walk slowly, or maybe I stop. Maybe I turn around to make sure nothing's behind me. Or maybe you just hear something and decide whatever's behind that door or inside that cave can stay there for another 30 seconds. The atmosphere has changed my actions and behavior without explicitly telling me how I'm supposed to feel. And that's immersion in a form that only an interactive medium can really achieve. Metroid Fusion, for example, twists that same isolation into something more direct with the SAX. In Super Metroid, I was weary because of, again, that masterfully portrayed oppressive and isolated atmosphere, all while not knowing what was lurking around this unknown planet, and having no idea where I was ever even going. In Fusion, silence could mean something I absolutely didn't want to find was nearby. Even the original Metroid creates its own version of this by explaining almost nothing, and sure, I know, of course, it's very crude and some of that is just a staple of the NES era, but even then, being lost on Zebes surrounded by seemingly endless, repeating rooms and strange music somehow almost made the confusion a core part of the atmosphere. You see, my dear guardian, sometimes, just sometimes, inconvenience can become immersion. And I'm definitely not arguing that every game should just throw away its map and force you to draw directions on that same sad, soggy napkin that you're using to wipe your tears away after dying for the 978th time in Castlevania 1, because plenty of old design decisions have disappeared, and for good reason. Just being confusing for no reason isn't just an easy scapegoat that somehow leads to brilliant game design by any means. However, there is something powerful about a game that doesn't ask me a question only to answer it for me before I can ever even think about it. Because mystery gives your imagination somewhere to go. And as I've said multiple times, and I'll die on this hill, your imagination will always create something that's much scarier than whatever the thing is that's supposed to be scary. The lesser known Demon's Crest is another one of the best examples of a game that I've played that succeeds in creating a phenomenal atmosphere. It doesn't have the hugest environments, but its crumbling castles, forests filled with dead trees, dark cathedrals, and night skies create the impression of a world that has history behind it, which is something that I said in that video. Crumbling walls and empty corridors don't always need an explanation. You're just this demon that's flying between dying places, all while a haunting soundtrack looms over everything. Now, I'd usually call that environmental storytelling, but sometimes these environments aren't telling you a specific story so much as suggesting one. A castle that's long since fallen doesn't necessarily require a cutscene explaining who destroyed it, who resided within it, and what its purpose was, if the atmosphere is done correctly. The Forest Temple in Ocarina of Time never explains what it is or why it's there. It's just some massive fortress that's in the middle of the woods that's been long since abandoned, and in my opinion, the Forest Temple has one of the strongest atmospheres of any location in any piece of media ever. Sometimes not knowing allows the world to extend way beyond what the devs physically created, and maybe even surpasses any intentions they ever even had, because part of it begins to exist within your imagination, and it only grows from there. And older games depended on that imagination way more than I ever realized, because in my opinion, technical limitations forced developers to suggest detail instead of literally creating all of it. Music had to establish feelings because facial animation couldn't. I mean, a mere handful of sprites had to convince you that a town was sprawling with life, and background art had to convince you that a world continued on far beyond the edge of the screen on that tiny little TV that you were seeing it on. A random mountain in the background didn't have to be somewhere you could actually go and climb, and a building didn't require 20 accessible rooms. Now, I'm definitely not saying that those are bad things, because they're definitely not depending on the game. All I'm saying here is that the limitations weren't always weaknesses. Sometimes they made these worlds feel larger. I mean, when you're watching the main characters walk through that snowy landscape during the opening scene of Final Fantasy VI, you're not thinking about whether or not you can go to the mountains that you can see in the background or how graphically insane it looks. You're thinking about the feeling that you're getting from the music and wondering what the story of these characters will be. And atmosphere can present itself in so many different ways. For example, Secret of Mana gave me a completely different version of that feeling because so much of its atmosphere comes from warmth and wonder. And that's important because atmospheric doesn't have to mean fog or abandoned buildings or landing on a deserted planet in the middle of a rainstorm. Those just happen to be my favorite ones. Its colorful forests and towns and music make the world feel alive beyond your small party of characters, while something like Symphony of the Night sits somewhere between those extremes. Dracula's castle can be extremely creepy, but oddly peaceful and almost beautiful. However, you know what they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so I just have an affinity for these types of atmospheres, but it's done so well here. The rooms don't feel engineered exclusively around efficiency just to get you from one point to the next. Some locations establish the castle itself as a character just by existing within this dark world, which is part of why I remember it as a place rather than a sequence of levels. Music is obviously a massive part of creating those feelings, but it works so well because it enhances those specific places. There are pieces of music where hearing the first few seconds immediately rebuilds an entire environment within my head. But creating great atmosphere doesn't mean you can just put beautiful or eerie or uncanny music on top of a random environment. Everything has to work in tandem with everything else. If Super Metroid's most lonely sections had a heroic orchestral theme blasting in the background, ZB's would feel completely different. If the SAX Infusion ever so politely waited around for me while an objective marker warned me exactly when and where it was going to show up, I don't think I would have spent half of my time expecting that son of a bitch to walk through any given door. Sound, art direction, level design, and gameplay all have to be working toward the same feeling. And that's something that I think contributes to the lack of atmosphere in so many modern games. The focus is so often heavily weighted to one aspect of the atmosphere, and that's usually graphical fidelity, putting all of the other aspects that should be just as, if not more important, in the background. When done correctly, atmosphere is way more than just decoration. It physically changes how you play the game. And this is where the difference between a lot of the older games I've been playing and modern game design becomes so much easier to see. Because modern games have spent decades getting incredibly good at removing friction, and yes, normally I'd say that that's a good thing depending on where that friction resides. We have better maps, autosaves, thank goodness, fast travel, objective tracking, and UIs that make games infinitely easier to understand. I'm not about to pretend that losing 3 hours of progress because you forgot to save or just died was an artistic statement, but at some point, removing friction got intermixed with removing uncertainty. And uncertainty was doing more for these worlds than I ever realized. When a game gives you a map that's completely covered with icons and tells you your destination is exactly 436 meters away in this exact direction, my friend, your relationship with the environment has now changed. You're no longer really navigating toward that mountain or remembering which road passed this certain rock and wondering what's hiding behind a random structure in the distance. You're moving toward a number that's getting smaller and smaller. Again, there are definitely games that do an amazing job of this, Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring being two huge ones for me. Developers obviously didn't create these systems because they just don't like immersion. They exist because getting lost can suck, and modern games are a lot of the time so large that guidance is necessary. But there is a difference between giving the player useful information while using the environment to tell you a story, and designing a world where it's doing all of the work that the environment could have done itself. Older games forced me to pay attention to the world and assumed that I at least had somewhat of a functioning IQ level. A recognizable structure became a landmark, and a suspicious wall made me stop to check it out, which probably led me to an unfamiliar area, which meant I better be paying attention because I might actually need to remember how I got there. When I didn't completely know where I was going, I naturally paid more attention to where I was, and it never felt forced for me. I wasn't just progressing through these worlds, I was learning them. And navigation isn't the only place where a lot of more recent games seem to struggle. Sometimes characters can explain puzzles before you even have time to understand what you're looking at, and tutorial prompts can interrupt immersion. When every single interesting place announces its presence before I've even found it, discovery suddenly starts to feel a whole lot less like discovery. None of what I'm saying means that I think atmosphere is dead. Again, there are obviously modern games that are great at it, and the fact that those games still connect with people proves that this style of design isn't outdated. But what feels different after playing so many older games is how often these atmospheric qualities are present seemingly by default. Sometimes it was intentional artistry or even hardware limitations. A lot of the time it could have just been an industry that hadn't developed all of today's conveniences, and it was sometimes probably just bad design that accidentally ended up creating something unique. Whatever the reason, there was often more empty space between the player and the game, and that empty space gave your imagination somewhere to go. And this is also why I don't think nostalgia completely explains it. Pretending that every old game was a masterpiece while everything today is garbage would be especially ridiculous coming from me, considering I didn't play most of these games until recently. I don't have childhood nostalgia for Super Metroid or any of these games. I experienced them decades later, and it still just felt like good atmospheres were more prevalent. And if nostalgia isn't doing all of the work, then something else in these games has survived the test of time. I don't think what we've lost is necessarily atmosphere itself as much as a willingness to protect it. Modern games can create worlds with a level of detail developers 30 years ago could have only dreamed of being able to create, but detail and atmosphere aren't the same thing. It's also why realism and immersion aren't necessarily the same thing either. Super Metroid, Demon's Crest, and Secret of Mana, and some of the other games I've played within the Regress series don't look real, but they don't need to. They only need to convince me that their worlds have an identity and exist beyond whatever happens to be on the screen. It also shows the severe lack of art design in modern gaming because a lot of these older games are absolutely beautiful. And I think accomplishing that ultimately comes down to trust. Trusting the art direction and sound design while trusting the player enough to let you become curious or uncomfortable. We don't need to understand every single thing about a world in order to care about it. Sometimes not understanding it is exactly why we do. So maybe retro games don't feel so different because they were objectively better, although in my opinion a lot of them are, but more than that, maybe the limitations and design philosophies of that era forced them to put the atmosphere of their worlds at the forefront. They couldn't show us everything or tell us everything, so we had to look, listen, and occasionally get completely lost. But what they did show us had to be extremely effective, and still to this day, it's more effective than I ever would have imagined.